on FM, online, and DSTV channel 889. This is Power 98.7.
This is Power 98.7. And now, you're listening to Power Talk with Lerato Mbele. Weekdays, 9 a.m. to midday on Power 98.7. Taking your calls on 0861 987 000.
I'd like to say the warmest welcome to all of you, our Power listeners, who are tuning in for the first time this Tuesday morning as we bring you a special broadcast kindly brought to you by the Gauteng Development Agency. Let me also say hello to all of you who are live streaming and watching us via video feed. As I said, it's 2 hours of a different conversation this Transport Month, where we really talk about integrating city living. Regardless of class, color, or creed, people should be able to commute to work, to school, to their places of worship. People should be able to do so affordably and efficiently. And we need to have the kind of transport infrastructure that just makes it easy to move around this vast expanse of Gauteng, Johannesburg, and other cities in and around the country. Now, there are a few statistics that we're aware of and that we've referred to this Transport Month. We know that the vehicle population in South Africa is 12 million. In other words, 12 million cars are on our roads. How many households own them? I don't know. But there's 12 million cars on our roads. And those 12 million cars find themselves in heavy concentration in cities like Johannesburg, Cape Town, Durban, Gqeberha, Buffalo City, Kimberley. But if you ask me, I think the majority of them are here in Gauteng. And that's why we're struggling to get to work on time, get to school on time, just run our businesses efficiently, because there's just so much congestion. I've often said it feels as if there are more cars than there is road. So that's the first issue. Some people, 300,000 of you, are able to use the Gautrain. Okay, not that you use the Gautrain every day, 300,000 of you, but we know that that's the number of trips we see per annum. So that removes that bit of congestion from the road. But we could see more people using rail, not necessarily high-speed rail, but also other forms of commuter rail. When we say to people, why don't you use trains? They say it's either too expensive, or it's not clean, or it's not safe. So actually, solving this one issue feels to me like low-hanging fruit. And this is why the Premier of Gauteng says, let's think about high-speed rail between Gauteng and Limpopo, for instance. We've already got Joburg and Pretoria. Let's just extend the line. We're going to find out about the feasibility of that. Then others are using public transportation. whether it's rear via buses or minibus taxis. And, to the extent where minibus taxis have become the bedrock or the mainstay of the public transportation system. So the question is, how do we integrate minibus systems into a better plan for efficient, safe, and reliable transportation? Yes, Nkuluma Nani Abo Mageza, you are also part of this conversation. How do we make it make sense? And then we can think about other aspects of mobility. We're told that in a world that needs to go clean and green, why don't we walk? That's me, that's you. Do you know, just for me to get to the nearest shopping center in my neighborhood, it's a kilometer's walk. But I hardly see us walking to the shops. I see us getting in our car to go to the shop. So if we're going to talk about managing even things like lifestyle diseases, why don't we adopt a culture of physical mobility, cycling to work, cycling to the gym, walking, and just being active in that way and getting out of a sedentary lifestyle. So the holistic picture of road, of rail, of using cars, of walking, of cycling, starts to speak to mobility in a modern sense. And because our cities are heaving, South Africa has the highest urbanization rate on the African continent. At 66% of the population now living in cities, we really have to think about moving around our cities in a safer, greener, and more affordable way. And that's the conversation we're having here today as we talk about transit-oriented development. I think we've covered the spectrum of what it entails, barring the issue of social cohesion, but I think our experts will explain and expand more on the technical aspects of it, the infrastructure aspects of it, and the developmental social aspects of it. So let's meet our panelists. Immediately to my right is Tshepo Kgobe, who is the CEO of the Gautrain Management Agency. Good morning. It is our pleasure. We also have Lourens Swanepoel, a transport economist specializing since 1988 in transportation and public transport operations. So a lot of experience, a wealth bank sitting right there. Thank you, Lourens. And we also have Dr. Matthew Townshend, who's the practice head of network industries of DNA economics and a development economist. Good morning.
Good morning, Jen, the listeners.
Thank you so much. Let's start with you, Tshepo Kgobe, because you said over and above everything we're talking about, Lerato, let us focus on social cohesion. What do you mean by that?
So let's talk about the issue of the people. So a lot of the technical descriptions of TODs always speak to, buildings, transport systems, and all of that. But beyond that, what do you build transport for? So a lot of the talks that I've been talking about how do you build transport into the lifestyle of the people? Yeah. At the current moment, you treat transport like a utility. You actually only realize it's not working when it's not working. Yeah. And in actual fact, when the question we are asking is that how do we build ourselves into a space where, in essence, we are part of your entire lifestyle. You can bet on us for you to go to the shops. You can bet on us to take your kids to school. You can bet on us to be able to actually make sure that everything that you need to do in the day is actually sorted out through transit. But how do we get you out of the monomodal habits? And I think our biggest problem in Gauteng is these monomodal habits. And when you build lifestyle when you build transport into a lifestyle, it's about a change in thinking. But how do you ensure that you can then, in South Africa, be able to adjust? So just to give you statistics, in South Africa, more than 50% of the people spend over 45% of their income on transport. Yeah. And you have to find a way in which you can change that. Yeah. And TODs are one of the ways in which we can do it.
You use the word monomodal. I'd just like you to qualify what it means. So I know mono means one, mode is how you get there. So are you saying that the mindset we have right now is I can only move if I have a bus or if I have a car? You don't think of different ways of integrating how you move around?
Yes, we've done a test in 2017. Gautengers, they will bear with you if they're going to change modes 2.5 times. When you get them to 3 times, they abandon you. So they will go with you if you gave them the Ariang bus and then got them onto Gautrain, and then it got them to where they're going. And then if you then ask them to take another mode after that, then they're going to take their car. But in actual fact, there are people who actually believe in just them driving the car, which is just them driving their car. So it's get to my house, get into that, and then I don't want to change. I leave my house, I'm in my car, and I'm going to get to work, I'm in my car, and I do the same trip the same way. And then there's also single occupancy vehicles. So that's the additional problem in all of this, is that it's one person in one vehicle and doing a very long trip.
Okay. There's quite a few things that have been said here. Let's bring into the conversation Lourens, Swanepoel, and it's the mindset. So I've just heard here, Gautengers, we want convenience. I can get on a bus and then maybe the train. But you're not putting me on another bus or a taxi or a scooter. Once that happens, I'm getting into my car. So there's an efficiency issue here, convenience issue here. And regardless of class, people don't want to be hassled when they're moving around.
Correct. Tshepo is 100% correct. It shows, studies that people don't want to transfer more than once. So you know, talking to the two modes of transport. That excludes the walking, the first and the last mile, the walking or the cycling to a station, for instance, and so on. So people like to have their trip times as short as possible, and the convenience part is extremely important. So they want to make sure that it's a seamless type of transport. It doesn't necessarily have to be on one specific mode only, but it needs to be seamless in terms of the physical transfer, but also the price that they're paying, the method of payment, those type of things. So they'd like to have a seamless experience.
But people will also say to you, here's the challenge of living in a city like Johannesburg, because it's spread out, you know. The more I live in the city, I'm not sure whether I'm living in Joburg or Centurion or Pretoria. You're just seeing the two centers coming together. That's how spread out the city is. And because it's built like that, public transportation can't cover that vast expanse. So I'm not sure that people wouldn't be using buses if the buses would do the distance. If we'd see buses in the Bryanston Fourways area, if a train could go all the way to, say, Lowly, outside of Soweto, and bring people in. So it's also the availability of this public infrastructure.
Also, from an operational perspective, operators look at feasibilities of the operations, and we always have an origin and a destination, serving a specific origin destination, and that might not 100% be according to what everyone would like to be. So one needs to make use of a combination. It's a bit of a basket of solutions. It can't be one solution for everyone. So the transfer is important, and the idea, for instance, of Tshwane, we are advocating that you can be transported from anywhere in the city to anywhere else in the city, depending on what your individual needs.
Matthew Townshend, let's bring you into the conversation, and I want to pick up on something Tshepo said earlier on, which is another problem we have, is single occupancy cars. And I think he was alluding to the fact that if we even want to reduce congestion on the road, we have to think about how we travel. So it's fine if you want to use your car, but do you need to be the only person in that car? Could you carpool, for instance? Could we be more creative with those solutions? What do you make of that?
Yeah, so the South African travel habits are very entrenched, and unfortunately they are very inefficient, as you say. Not just sort of from a time and efficiency perspective, but from a multiple variety of angles. If you look at it from an environmental perspective, it's a big problem in single occupancy. It's a big problem that there has probably been a push for at least prior to sort of the 2010 World Cup even, in trying to have advocacy campaigns, trying to change consumer preferences for how they move. And if you look at the congestion patterns and the travel patterns, there hasn't been radical changes in terms of the profiles that you've seen in the past. So in terms of taking a multifaceted approach towards trying to transform transport, trying to think of it not just as rail, trying to think of it also as buses, trying to put people closer in, and this is one of the aspects which I'm sure will come out from today's discussion, but trying to think of transit-orientated development as having much sort of smaller and more mixed-use communities, where if then campaigns to try and change that sort of single occupancy sort of travel pattern are only semi-successful, you've also then got a variety of other angles coming in, that then people are able to much more easily commute via non-motorized transport options. The buses for the shorter trips come into play. So I think it's taking a bigger angle to it, bearing in mind that we obviously do have very difficult and entrenched travel patterns that are
I mean, when I started with that preamble, I said, I often feel, and this is not scientific, it's just my view, so many cars on Joburg roads, I'm not sure we have enough road. And that doesn't mean that SAM hasn't done its job or the municipality's not refurbishing or expanding the road network. It just feels like the city is heaving. It just feels like there are a lot of us trying to go to one place in the morning or in the afternoon, and that's why we're sitting in traffic for 45 minutes to an hour and a half for what should be a 20-kilometer, 15-kilometer ride. And this is where strategies on managing congestion come in. So a city like London, which I know well because I live there, they introduced a congestion charge. They simply said, if you're going to drive into the CBD, you're going to pay for it, a toll. Parking is going to be made impossible for you in the city. You're going to pay up to 300 rands an hour to be in the city. So when you start to do the economics of using your own car, you realize I'd rather be on a bus or a train or whatever. But that's because there are buses and trains and alternatives. That's not quite the story in South Africa. So if we've got to manage the congestion issue and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we've got to have the infrastructure that supports that lifestyle.
I think you raise a few very interesting points there, because transit-orientated development, if you put all of these public transport options in place, there are so many benefits that can come from it. You just mentioned a few there which are very interesting and which I'd like to reiterate for the listeners, is now if you have the option to travel via a functional and safe public transport mode, or you could walk as an option or cycle, and then you choose to drive into the city, then that is a choice, and it is not punitive to now implement a tax to say your parking charges will be very high, there will be a congestion charge, etc., etc. But that only becomes fair in the sense that there are viable options in place. And if the city can put those viable options in place, then we now talk about the level of financial strain that the cities are under, that they don't have enough revenue. There are a number of new revenue sources that come into the mix once the sort of transport ecosystem is working better.
Okay. Tshepo, before we go into the high-level discussion, a question just came through, and you must expect this question. Lerato says, somebody says, Nell says, Lerato kopa ongzamele, please. OR Tambo, 219 rands for a single trip, but going to Pretoria, 70 rands. Why is there this discrepancy?
Okay, I get that question a lot, and I'm trying to answer it in such a way that I don't end up in trouble. The time I've done this, so an APS, an airport passenger service, by its nature, it's priced in a particular manner. It is intended for a particular set of people that are going to a particular point, and in essence, in itself, does it have the right context in South Africa? We'll have to rethink that. So, in essence, first and foremost, is you have to know where we sit in terms of airport passenger services around the world. We do the rating. I think there's about 23 that are fully functional and about 40 of them that are half and half. So we sit at probably just below the bottom 3 of the 23. So we are the 20th in terms of pricing. When you go up, and that's us sitting in and around the about $11 mark. If you are using the London one, you're paying 3 times that. If you're using the New York one, you're paying double that. And the various cities, you're paying 2.5 times that amount. Is it the right price for South Africa? We are actually relooking that as well as we go into the new concession, and it was designed purely as an APS and an airport passenger service in itself. The North-South is a general passenger service. It's a commuting line. It is not intended to ferry people to an airport or to do anything. It's intended to be able for you to go up and down, and that is why the pricing is like that. But it is something that we're looking at earnestly and looking at it as, does it still make sense in the context of where we are post-COVID? Does it actually really have to still be that way?
I think, and I'm raising this issue because we're going to have headlines in a moment. I think to people, the trains look the same. They look to the naked eye. So you might consider it a different sort of category of ferrying passengers, but to my eye, the train that's going to the airport and the train that's going to Pretoria looks exactly the same. It looks like the same infrastructure, the station looks the same, and I know the assets, somebody manages the station, you own the asset, we understand that. But why are we paying differently? And in fact, it even feels like Pretoria is even further away than the airport. So all of that just doesn't make sense.
It has to make sense, and it has to make sense on the economics of transport. So one of the first few things that you will notice is that instead of the 2-3 configuration, we have a 2-2 configuration seat. The seats are wider, which means I have taken a seat out, which I would have used to be able to charge so that I can recover more money. We have luggage racks, so those luggage racks also take out more seats. So per coach, I have fewer seats. And if you were to think of it in terms of recovery rates, and you think of my logic, and we avoid standing on that, what do they call it, on that particular service. Yeah. And in essence, people who stand on the airport service, normally it's by choice. So by its nature, I'm recovering, I have fewer seats to actually recover the cost of what do they call it, of operating the service. And that's in its simplest economic point of view, and looking at it from the number of seats you have within the vehicle are fewer, because I've taken the 3-2 configuration, I have a 2-2 configuration, and I've given you a wider seat and a much more comfortable seat, and I've given you luggage racks so that you don't sit with your suitcase with you when you're sitting where you're sitting. I have more, so I used to live in, what do they call it, in England, and I've seen people held people's bags off, what do they call it, of trains that are coming from the airport. I have more security on those vehicles to actually guard your bags.
I've understood now. Going to the airport, one, is a choice. It's not something you have to do, whereas commuting to work. But secondly, this is like business class, economy class. It's a business class train that's going to the airport, and it's coach that's going to Pretoria. And you're paying for the business class ticket. Now, I hope that answers your question. It's news time. Good morning. All right, thank you very much to the news teams. Thank you to Nyaka Lodefa and the news teams for keeping us up to date with what is happening on our roads and in our country at the moment. We're bringing you a special broadcast on transit-oriented development strategies for the country, and looking at how we can integrate our different transport systems to serve you, the citizens of Gauteng, and effectively the citizens of South Africa. So it's a special broadcast. We're just outside of the studio today with a live audience in front of us, and I know many of you are watching via the streaming service on YouTube, and I want to say to you hello and welcome to what is an integrated broadcast, simulcast, visual and audio, and we're using the same sort of principle when we talk about how we can bring together various different facets of our transport economy in a way that is functional and workable. So far we've covered quite a few issues. We've spoken about what transit-oriented development is, and simply my understanding, but I'm sure our experts will clarify it for us, is that where you live, where you work, where you play, you've got to be able to get there speedily, you've got to be able to get there affordably, you've got to be able to get there safely, and you need to have choice. You don't have to take an e-hailing service. You don't have to take a high-speed train. You can take a commuter government train. You can take a minibus taxi. You can take a bus. You can even take a tram. But it's the availability of all of these services at your doorstep that matters. Security also matters. So even if there are trains, you need to feel safe on that train, for instance, or safe in that taxi. For those of you who are already thinking about your blissful futures, you shouldn't have
have to pay an arm and a leg to do this, right? So those who want to use Uber Black because you're in that lifestyle, that's okay, but it shouldn't have to be that way when you've got options in front of you. And then, we've also spoken about the fact that South Africa is a very big country. And whilst many of us do work in and around Johannesburg and Gauteng, our families don't live here. Certainly the families that we love, our grandparents, our extended families, they live elsewhere in the country. And so the trip home, as beautiful a trip as it should be, shouldn't also take up a lot of your time. Whether you're going home for a long weekend or coming Christmas vacations, you should be able to get on a train at Park Station and be in KZN by the end of the day. You shouldn't have to be sitting it out on a minibus taxi. You could be on a luxury bus if you need to. But all of that works when you've got the right investments into the public infrastructure, and you've also got the private investors who've been brought into the transport economy as well. And so public-private partnerships really matter in the costing and the so-called subsidization of transport systems. So let's continue with our conversation. We have Tshepo Kgobe, who is the Gautrain Management Agency Chief Executive Officer. Seated next to him is Lourens Swanepoel, a transport economist who's been working in this area of transportation and public transport operations for many, many, many years and decades. We also have Dr. Matthew Townshend, who's the practice head of network industries at DNA Economics and Development, and he's a development economist. We also have your questions coming through online, and I'm reading out some of them. And we have a studio audience, and we can all shout, Gautrain. Because Gautrain is the gold standard. And the CEO, ironically, has said it shouldn't be the gold standard. It should be one of the many exceptional ways in which we move people around Gauteng. Dr. Matthew, let's start with you. Of all the things that have been said here today, we tapped into the example of Geneva, Switzerland, but what I'm just scared of is we always use Switzerland with its fabulous railway system as the standard of how it should be done. There should be other examples worldwide that we can draw on and say, when you've got cities with high density, high urbanization, people on the move, how do you get it right? So let's talk about international best practice.
Perfect. So I think to canvas the discussion of international best practice, it's quite important to go over the facets of transit-orientated development, and then to think about them within the South African context and what are the features and elements that we want to be changing. So to repeat the very good definition that you'd given already, transit-orientated development is essentially about breaking cities down into much smaller sort of neighborhood size elements and having mixed use spaces available within them. So because you've got a smaller neighborhood, which is essentially walkable, or you could travel by bicycle, because it's that smaller distance, if within that you could have commercial elements, you could have residential elements, you could have leisure elements, then essentially you have a self-sustaining community, which becomes quite easy to manage from a transport perspective. And then what you essentially want to do is along the urban boundary, you want to connect all of these different elements together via your bone transport systems. So then you've got sort of that hub and spoke type system where you've got within a neighborhood, you've got all of your, and we were talking about this earlier, all of your modes of transports which are specifically intended for your shorter last mile trips running within them. Because you've also got an integrated space, there should be the options to walk around, to travel by bicycle, etc., which make it more affordable and much more livable. Now, there's also within that an added dynamic within the South African context, which is how you also integrate lower cost housing and how you integrate sort of spatial transformation. The fact that it's definitely not ideal and it's not fair that you've got certain elements of society who are just precluded from being able to afford and live within the city. So how does the government, and this is where the PPP conversation and the public responsibility conversation from a financing perspective,
how do you bring the picture together of who pays for what in terms of the transport development and the services that are available, the housing opportunities that are put in place. And when we look wider at international examples, there are examples where maybe the transport element works well, but they haven't got the added pressure of trying to incorporate the housing transformational element into it. The other point that I would like to bring into the conversation for now, but before we start to look at examples, is the fact that in South Africa you've also got very established infrastructure and urban designs. And how much financing is available to change spaces is a big one. So I had a brief conversation now about the idea of non-motorized transport and the idea of whether you'd want to cycle. Well, what would be required for cycling to be a viable option in many places is a road upgrade and a pavement upgrade. And now you're talking about bringing in many stakeholders, many different budget sort of purse holders who have very limited funding to say, well, we want these transit-orientated spaces and we want them to fit this model.
There's many things you've said there, and obviously I like to use practical examples. That's just how my mind works. So I'm going to go back to my neighborhood, and I'm going to tell you how we live, and then you're going to tell me if we're starting to see the makings of a transit-oriented development program. And I'm going to defer to Alexander. I drive through there sometimes, and then you can tell me. So in my neighborhood, close-knit, yes, as affluent and aspirational, I'm not going to shy away from that, privilege, and we've got that inequality issue in South Africa. But we have shopping center within a 2-kilometer radius. We've got gyms. We've got schools and nursery schools and churches. And frankly, my church on my street is about 500 meters away. I should be able to walk to church. I shouldn't be driving to church. The nearest strip mall is 2 k's away. I should be fit enough, if healthy enough, to walk there. I shouldn't have to drive there. But if for whatever reasons I can't walk there, I should be able to get into a small little taxi or tram to get me there and back and do my shopping. And picking up my kids from school, I should be able to send my mother or my helper also using a small taxi or e-hailing to do that. And then by the time I'm coming to Power FM, I should be able to leave my house, get to the nearest bus station, get on a BRT system, and make it all the way to Houghton. That's ideal. So I've got some of those mini elements, but I don't have the BRT because, the city is so huge. And that distance from my house to Power FM is no less than 25 kilometers. We have a problem there.
Yeah, so I think we can, and this is where it becomes a complex issue to solve, and where time frames and expectations become very important expectations to manage. So if we first look at your first issue, and that was the one that you raised about getting access to schools, etc., which are right there. You're talking a few hundred meters sometimes. There needs to be comprehensive infrastructure in place for walking to be viable. You need to have, if it's a wide road, you actually need a pedestrian bridge. You need road rules to be properly enforced. You need traffic lights to be functional. To try and cross a big intersection, which is now a 4-way stop, it's hazardous, to say the least. So when you start trying to talk about transit-orientated development and for it to work, there are many stakeholders. It's not just a transport issue. It's a whole sort of services package that needs to come together. I think your other point that you raised, which was very interesting, which talks to Lourens's point, which he'd brought up earlier, is the transport modes that we do have are not serving the purposes for which they were ideally designed and for which we want them to be essentially providing the consumers. So you should be able to go to a shopping center, and at a shopping center there should be shuttles that sort of run out from there to take you back to your house or close-ish, that you can then carry your groceries back. That's not what minibus taxis are for in South Africa. They have, due to the way that our transport demand and systems have evolved, they fulfill a completely different function.
Okay, so second
bring the other gentleman is let's go to a low-income area, Alexandra. And I just remember walking around Alexandra, and I sometimes have to drive through there. So there you are seeing some semblance, not enough, of social housing, low-cost housing coming through. There's definitely the big London road that connects the one side of Alexandra all the way through to the highway. So there is an artery. And at the end of the artery on the one side is a new BRT system. There are schools dotted along the way and a couple of clinics. Not enough, but you do see that social infrastructure. And for people who are moving in and around Alexandra, they use these small cabs, single-seater cabs, Bajaj cabs. I know people have a view, to move in and around the neighborhood. And then that little cab can take you all the way to the BRT, or can take you into the opposite direction to the big buses that will connect to the highway. It's not ideal, but you see a semblance of it.
So I think this talks to, and that BRT in particular, it talks to a challenge that we have in South Africa, which when we now talk to the international examples will become quite interesting. Because we have, especially the developing country examples, we have much less financing to go around. So when we talk about the subsidizations that are in place, they are not unlimited subsidies. We need to be very smart about where we direct our funding. So to have a BRT system that is in place, that on paper when it was designed looked like it would be very functional. But then when it comes to actual consumer demands, if you look at where everybody gets dropped off in relation to their work points, they can get to the BRT system, but then they're still 3 kilometers from their office. So they need to get into a minibus taxi in any case. So it's easier to get into the minibus taxi from your point of destination, from departure. So we have essentially a system in South Africa now where when you spoke about the Geneva examples of trams and buses and trains, we obviously don't have the trams in place, but we have a lot of the elements, each of them in their own individual way is slightly suboptimal and draining a lot of the scarce funding that we do have.
I don't want to belabor this point, but maybe, Tshepo, you can talk to us about some international best practice models we can emulate.
So when you look at the number, so when we had to look at the company as it is right now and relook at what could we really do with the Gautrain, we had to look at the number of examples. And I'll start with the first world country examples, and then we'll come back to the ones that actually are similar to ours. But one of the things that we learned is almost nothing is exactly like South Africa. So there are parts in other parts of the world that are like South Africa. If you go to the US, the urban sprawl is there. They have the same problem. You go to Canada, the same thing. The urban sprawl is there. But they do not have the kind of these, sort of makeshift dwellings that are closer to certain places that don't make sense, and you don't have slums that are very close to certain cities. So if you look at metro links in Canada, what ended up happening to Toronto is that Toronto to the southern side is Lake Ontario. To the north, it's vast lands, and the suburbs started growing in that direction. And what the suburbs did is they took the cars out of the city, and the city became very empty. But you had a lot of transport, so you've got in order they call it in Toronto, you've got a metro system that runs up and down along Lake Ontario, because everything is always oriented against Lake Ontario. You've got a lot of trams that run in and around the city, but they don't go to the northern suburbs. But the northern suburbs is what brings cars into the inner city. So you got to think differently, and what they've done now is that they've now started building metro links in itself, which is built in and around not only rejuvenating the city, but also bringing services. Because transit-oriented development, what ends up happening with a lot of the suburbs is that suburbs end up without services. So people who live in the suburbs still have to commute into the inner city to go and get services for them to get their groceries, for them to get all of these things. In South Africa, what you started having, you have these small strip malls all around that try and service some of the needs, but you still have to commute to the large mall for you to do all of these things. So it's a complex problem to sort out. Now, what we need to then do, and then you've got the big malls. For instance, we've got a mall in order they call it in Midrand. It's a huge mall. It has no taxi parking. And another thing, parking, it's not the ranking facility, because the ranking facility normally functions very well. It's what do you do with those taxis during the day? It's the holding facility. Sandton suffers from the same problem, where the whole of Sandton has no holding facility. And we have to resolve these issues. And then there's the new issue that has come up, which is the Ubers and the ride hailing. That in itself, there's no parking for ride hailing.
All right. We're just going to park it there for a moment, better than the malls, and then just take a short commercial break and then some headlines. And then we can continue looking at international best practice, because I know that not all examples are European or American. We've also got some examples from Malaysia and also from India, and we can talk about PPPs all in a moment. All right, welcome back to all of our listeners and our viewers via YouTube. We're bringing a conversation around transit-oriented development. Transit obviously speaks to the transportation nodes, but the development speaks to social housing, schools, hospitals, clinics, the things that build neighborhoods and communities, that absorb people coming into the cities, but can make it easy for you to live in and around your neighborhood, self-actualize, but then get you where you need to get you. There, where your home is, work, and into all the other social spaces you need to get to. And so, you know, when you're living a fully functional life, you know that you can walk to the shops, walk to school, walk back. If you don't feel like walking, it's a glaringly hot day out in summer because our summers are warmer, you should be able to get on a tram or a shuttle to get you to school and back, and then get on a bus or a train to get to work and back. If you want to, you can drive, but that should be a choice. We shouldn't necessarily all be having cars because we need to. We should have them because we want to. And so those are sort of the conversations we're having here today, this morning. But just before we continue with our guests, let me just remind you that October 2024 marks the 19th anniversary of Transport Month, a vital initiative by the National and Provincial Department of Transport. This year's campaign highlights the progress being made to build better infrastructure, to create jobs, and to boost an inclusive, sustainable economy, all while enhancing service delivery. So we're doing more together, building better infrastructure, delivering efficient services through collaboration, a message brought to you by the National Department of Transport. And I guess that then is a beautiful segue into the conversation we're having here with the CEO of the Gautrain Management Agency, Tshepo Kgobe, joined by Lourens Swanepoel. He's got a truly illustrious CV, and he just said to me, Leonardo, don't read out everything I've done. The important bit is that I'm the Divisional Head of Transport for the city of Tshwane. And we also have Dr. Matthew Townshend, who's the Practice Head of Network Industries at DNA Economics. And both gentlemen are development economists, one a transport economist and one a development economist. We were, before the news, talking about international best practice. And Tshepo, you were talking to us about what's happening in Toronto, Canada. And earlier during the break, you said, I want to raise the issue of Canada, Lerato, because it actually reminds us how you build in a sprawling mass. It's fine to use Hong Kong or Kuala Lumpur, but Johannesburg in its current form looks more like a Canada. People work in this center, but live to the west, to the east, to the north, vast distances. And it's those vast distances we have to consider. You spoke about that sprawling mass. Tell us about that.
Roger, the biggest problem that we don't have is we don't have the densities. In all those examples of everywhere else in the world, specifically Europe, the densities are there. Now, densities are like viabilities. For the operator, one must also always have a win-win type of situation, government versus the operators of these public transport services. So if you don't have the densities, you simply can't sell the seats. The operators are there to sell seats. And if they can sell a seat more than once in a specific trip, the more money they can make, the more viable it is, the less subsidies are needed, the less contribution from government and so on. Also bringing in walking distances. People like to walk papers and so on where there's directions of of 800 meters and 500 meters and so on. But typically people, research show that people typically don't want to walk further than 10 minutes.
Yeah.
So rather looking at not how far, but how long they actually walk. Also in these densities, you need smaller blocks. People need to be configuring through these blocks very, very easily. You spoke about the issue of a type of a distribution service, taking people to church and work and whatever, within those nodal points. But again, if it's not a viable service, it will not be sustainable. So those are the specific issues. In the city of Tshwane, we've got a issue of trying to decongest our CBD. And basically getting rid of the private vehicles in the inner CBD, but also the minibus taxis. Tshepo was talking about the need for holding. We've got a need for holding areas within the city, and we've constantly got a competition between the different types of land use. Housing departments want to put up housing there. Environment guys want to keep things green. And yet we're looking for a place where we need to put the taxis and place them in the middle of the day.
I'm glad you've just said housing department and others want to keep things green. The reason why we're having this conversation also speaks to the world that is upon us. A world of heavy greenhouse gas emissions and the need to clean up the pollution in the atmosphere to create livable cities, a livable planet that the World Bank even talks about. So talk to us about how a proper, well thought through TOD starts to address some of these issues.
At the end of the day, one needs to look at all the different land uses. You cannot only look at one land use and neglect the others. One needs to have a synergy of the different land uses to actually create that livable space. People staying in high-rise buildings in a CBD, for instance, would need a place to go and walk. They need some green areas, but yet all the other the work opportunities needs to be there. The recreational aspects, obviously the transport catalyst and so on, needs to be within walking distances to actually get to work.
Okay, by a show of hands, questions on the floor? Yes.
My interest is around long-distance transportation, and I think that South Africa has one of the best, and in terms of by network and radius, the largest rail network in Africa, and we know that particularly around PRASA. PRASA had a subsidiary of Autopex that was doing passenger transport. And I think that the system is in place, but we've seen that the decays of that system and infrastructure over the years. And I believe that the blueprint is there. The fact that South Africa, it's in the global, urban mobility readiness, it shows that we do have the capacity and the infrastructure. For me, is to how do we find private partnership? Because I believe that government and the fiscus cannot really afford to remodel the rail infrastructure, recapitalize the rail infrastructure. But I believe that we've seen, particularly with Gautrain, that concessioning, it's working. And how far are we as government really to issue out this concession and get the system rehabilitated and get the right partners with the capital equity to ensure that we can build a global transport system that integrates cities, because of feasibility studies in the Polokwane line and the KZN line is done. It's capital that is not there. So that is my question. Any of the speakers who can really answer that question, I'll be happy. Thank you.
Do we have another question in the room? Just by a show of hands? Up front. Okay. So government can create the enabling environment, the policy, but really and truly the layout capital, they don't. Maybe even the DFIs can come in. Your views?
So it is a huge space that we have to look at. And you spoke about long distance transport in particular originally, and that's what your interests were. We have an ability to be able to do something interesting. So with the multi-access of railways and the advent of the legislation that allows for vertical separation of the railway line and allowing more operators to come on stream rather than just having a single monolithic operator, it's going to be an interesting space. But as I've warned at one of the conferences in Cape Town, we are near to where we need to be, but we're still far away. So you still need a lot of regulation. So you need, if we're saying Lerato today wants to set up a company, and I say, Lerato, okay, I need all your trains to be fit to be able to run on this network. We don't have the regulations that then say, what does Lerato's trains are supposed to look like and what does the norms and standards. So we need to sort out the technical specifications for interoperability. Those are the first things that we need to put in place. We also need to sort out the things like, how do you certify a network? So we are good at certifying operators to operate, but because we always had a vertically integrated railway line. Now we've separated it out, but we have a certificate, an operating certificate for the operator, but you do not have a certificate for the network. How do you certify? So all these things need to be sorted out, and it's the finicky engineering things that nobody wants to touch. Everybody can talk about the money and its availability from the private sector and also other things and I don't want to sound like a government person who wants more rules and more regulations, but the day an accident occurs, we all are going to be looking for these rules.
I know you want to come in, Lourens. My simple question is, with the advent of technology and refining a lot of the physical infrastructure, I mean, even if you came up with regulations today in 2024, would they even apply in 2034?
No, there's a lot of people who are ready. I must say, they are, and I've spent a lot of time engaging the market as such. The market is ready, but the market itself doesn't know what it's ready for. It says we're ready. It says the trains are here. It says this and that is here. And I said, right, okay, right, now, let's start. Okay? You know the checklist is going to come out. So, do you have that? Do you have that? Do you have that? Do you have that? And then the other thing that we have in the rail industry in particular, and maybe Lourens can talk about the bus industries, the skills. It took me 10 years to build a Gautrain as it is right now, on the Gautrain Management Agency as it is right now. And it was just me organically being able to find people and build it up. We're capable of what we do because it has been built by somebody. Now, for you to be able to build rail companies, the rest of them are struggling to be able to find people because we all are borrowing from the same pot.
Okay, Lourens?
Rather, to just in reaction to Hamlet's question, if we really want to be a first world type of country in terms of our transport, we definitely need to look at the long distance traveling. We've got the so-called sub-projects, strategic investment projects, and if government doesn't take the leading role and bring the private sector in, this will definitely not work. We need to start with feasibility studies. We need to look at where the demand is, and then the technologies is out there. We can buy it off the shelf type of thing, but we need to get that partnership between government and the private sector correct.
My name is Rodney Rambuda. Like he has already introduced me, I'm a CEO of Alexander Transport Solution that runs the feeder and distribution services between Marlborough and various areas. I'll start by just raising a comment in what we've been saying, and the key words: convenience, efficiencies, seamless transfers. Those are the things that are making us not to have a good public transport. In the space that I operate, I've realized that once we can try and link all these modes of transport, that would be the win for most of the people that are using public transport on a daily basis, because the problem is that we are so fragmented. The taxis are there, BRT is there, Gautrain is there, Praza rail services is there, and they are not integrated. Maybe the question will be, what role can Gautrain and other government departments, as well as role players, stakeholders in transport, what is that we need to do to fast track integration? Because that's the only key, that's the golden key that we have. We've been talking about one ticketing system forever, and that one ticketing system is not coming. I mean, if you look at Park Station, you have got your Praza Rail Reserve, you have got taxis, you have got Gautrain, you have got BRT station here, Gautrain station here, but all those services are actually not linked, and that is a key, and that is not actually happening. And the question will be, how fast can we do that, and what is that we require to actually make that it works?
Response?
So, Rodney, let's make the year 2025 the year that we make it all happen. That's all I'm going to say. So there's a lot of things that are afoot now. With me also presiding over the Transport Authority at the current moment, those are the key things that I have to deal with. And you've just read my individual performance contract for that one company. So those are the things that I have to worry about. But you know what we have a problem with, Rodney? We have a problem of over planning. And both Matthew and what do they call it, and Lourens will tell you, we are overplanned. But the problem with that overplanning is that it's not integrated. It doesn't come together somewhere. And I think the role of the Transport Authority now, it's going to be the ability for us to be able to bring all of these together and be able to. So I spent 2 days with the team taking me through the integrated transport master plan. I left there more confused than when I arrived, because there were too many plans to look at, and all these plans have different pillars in them and what we're trying to achieve. And eventually I got to a point of saying, what are we trying to achieve? And we need to get to that central answer that we need to answer. What are we trying to achieve? And this conversation we're having of transit-oriented development is but one of the achievements that we need to bring at some point in time.
Any more questions from the floor? Going, gone. Quickly, Matthew, go ahead.
No, perfect. I was just going to double down on that point with the planning and the fact that we don't have integrated modal, cross-modal sort of integration and consistency. And it talks to the rail problem and the passenger rail problem. If you look at the sort of all of the thinking that's happening around the reform on the rail network, it's almost completely freight rail dominated, and the passenger rail is hardly being considered. In fact, it's seen as a sort of a financial liability, something that would detract from the financing. The greater social importance of it falls away from the conversation. And I'd just like to conclude on that.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so please very briefly, Lourens, and then I'll give the last word to Tshepo.
Everything boils down to the issue of modal integration. Now, we as cities, Tshwane is no exception, are creating these books as Tshepo was saying. But at the end of the day, we need to get down to things like physical integration, and I think we're doing that with termini and stations and so on. We're not doing very well with the network integration. We're not doing very well with the fare integration. Yeah. We're not doing at all any well with the services integration, and those are exactly the things that counts when you bring the modes together. All the cities have got these so-called integrated public transport networks, but we are paying lip service to. Yeah,
I do like the whole fare integration. You buy one ticket and you can use it on the bus, on the train, on the bus. Okay, Tshepo, please, as we say goodbye, could you elaborate a little bit more about the Gautrain extension project?
Left that one for the last 2 minutes. Okay, so the new line and in itself. So we have the Gautrain extensions as we've brought them out, and then we have what we call the Gautrain Super Network. The Gauteng Super Network is a network that covers all the special economic zones and connects them back to the central urban core. There are sort of 2-3 decisions that we made, but I'll talk to two that we made in 2013. One of the things that we said we're going to conserve our green spaces in Gauteng. Secondly, we're going to densify. So we will not build outside of the urban core. And that is with us starting to be able to see where that's an intent of doing that. Now that high rises, as we build our special economic zones which are outside of the urban core, we will need a public transport system that will connect us back. But as we sort out the connecting back to the special economic zones, we are trying to sort out the inner city and the inner, so the intra-city. So there's the inner city and the intra-city connectivity. 70% of all people in Gauteng travel across city boundaries every day. 70%. And we've got more than close to 8 million people that actually have to travel every day. And when you start talking about 70% of them going from Tshwane to Johannesburg, but also it's about us understanding the desire lines. Where do people want to go? And we should stop being emotional about points to reinforce. A lot of the cities that have done well with transit-oriented developments, they have chosen points to reinforce. We have decided, and you'll hear the Premier talking about the CBD and reinforcing the CBD. We have to reinforce the CBD of we have to reinforce the CBD of Tshwane. We have to reinforce the CBD of Ekurhuleni. And then in turn, acknowledge the role of Rosebank and what do they call it, and Sandton. And then intentionally build such a way that we actually give more public transport and more different ways. Because that's where people want to go. That's where the jobs are at. And as you do public transport and transit-oriented development, you have to make these decisions and stop being emotional about who built what when. It's there, and now we have to work with it.
All right. Gentlemen, I want to thank you for your time. I think it's such a broad topic to cover in the amount of time we've been given, but at least it does give us some tidbits. And I think what I've gathered from this conversation is that we have to be reimagining South Africa and its cities, because people want to live in the cities. That's what they want. And it has to be affordable for everybody to live in the city. It has to be functional, it has to be safe, it has to be efficient. It's okay to be aspirational in a developmental state and want a car and a big house. There's nothing wrong with that. But you shouldn't necessarily have to be getting into your car every time you want to do a simple trip to the shopping mall, or to pick up your kids from school, or to visit a friend. Transportation should enable you to be social in this kind of environment, and should make it easy and safe and affordable for you to do so. We shouldn't be traveling these long distances to get to work, and if we do, we should be able to use a train or a bus or a tram or whatever the system may be. Technology is an enabler. Policy is the proper regulator. Investment is the funder. But all of it has to serve the humanity, that is the people of Gauteng and the people of South Africa. And the world, from cities of Hong Kong to Mumbai to Canada, are doing it. We can do it too. If I've covered that well, then thank you very much to you, Tshepo Kgobe, the Gautrain Management Agency CEO. Thank you very much to you, Lourens Swanepoel, transport economist, specializing in transportation and public transportation operations, but currently the divisional head for transport in the city of Tshwane. And thank you for your inputs, Dr. Matthew Townshend, practice head of network industries at DNA Economics and also a development economist. Thank you to our studio audience. You can say goodbye to Power listeners. And thank you to all of you who watched online. It's been a special edition of Power Talk this Tuesday. We do it again tomorrow. Cheers.
The Transit-Oriented Development Panel discussion was proudly brought to you by Gautrain, for people on the move.